change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And this day they circled the city 7 times, and the trumpets blew. And Joshua told the people at the end of the 7th lap to all shout, and then the walls fell flat. And the only one to be saved were the ones in Rahab's house as a promise to her for hiding the spies. But everybody else was to be destroyed along with the animals. And people, they tend to get upset about the death of all the people here. And they often look at God as if God's unfair or God's unkind. And nowadays, it would seem like people get more upset about the animals being killed. But God, He knows exactly what He's doing. And if these people could have been saved, they would have been saved. But they had no interest in surrendering to God or to Israel. And God has been patient with these people, and He's put off destroying them for 400 years since Abraham's time. Because we have where God had said in Genesis 15 that the iniquity of the Ammonites is not yet complete. And so here, after 400 years of God's patience, the people, they still hadn't changed. But now their iniquity is complete. And you can see here, they never once sought for peace. And God, He will always do what He says He's going to do, even though God is very patient. And I believe that's where our world is right now, where the Lord says He's coming back to our world and He's going to take the land. He's going to take the whole earth for His people to inherit. But the world isn't interested in the return of Christ. And they're not trying to flee to Christ, and they're not trying to make peace, though they know He's coming. And God's invitation is there, but they're just not interested. And there's only a few of us, Rahab the harlots, who even want to be saved, where God is coming to rescue us. But the rest of this world, it will be destroyed if they won't make a covenant with Him. And if they won't make a covenant like the red cord out of Rahab's window, which is a faith in the blood atonement of Jesus Christ. If they won't do that, they will be destroyed. Okay, so now after these walls, they fell, everyone ran straight ahead as instructed into Jericho. And they're told not to take the accursed things. And everything in Jericho was accursed, except for the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron. And those things were to be put into the Lord's treasury. And usually in a battle, when an army is defeated, those who fought in the battle, they share the spoils of the battle. But this being the first battle in the possessing of the promised land, they are the first fruits, and the first fruits are always dedicated to God. And there will be many more battles where they will share in all the spoils, but this time everything is considered holy. And the only part of the wall that didn't fall was Rahab's house, though it doesn't say that here. We assume that. And some will try to explain the falling of the walls. They'll say there was an earthquake or sonically something happened with the blowing of the trumpets and the shouting of the people. But it doesn't record it that way. And the reason it doesn't record it that way is because it didn't happen that way. There is no evidence that there was ever any natural disaster. And we're not told it toppled over or that we're told that it fell flat. And when you get to the book of Hebrews in chapter 11 in verse 30, it tells us that it was by faith that the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. So there's nothing ever mentioned except for faith. And then we read about how Rahab and her family were kept outside the camp. And the reason they were kept outside the camp is because they were Gentiles. And so they would have to be kept outside until their males were circumcised, until all of them came under the covenant of Israel. And after Rahab was rescued, the city was burned, and it was never to be lived in again, because these are the kind of people that are spoken about in Deuteronomy 18. These are a people who burned their children and sacrificed them to demons. They practiced witchcraft and sorcery. They listened to psychics, and they also went to mediums to call up the dead. And God hates all these things. And the people who practice all these kind of things, those people hate God. And so Jericho was cursed, and not just for this time, but it was cursed for all time. And Joshua tells the people what will happen to the man who dares to build this city again. And that's because God knows that it's going to happen one day. And even though he's writing this to them as a warning, and he tells them that his firstborn will die when he lays the foundation. And then he says that his youngest son will die when he sets the city gates. And that's exactly what happened. And you can read that because it tells you that in 1 Kings 16, because the Bible does record that. And it was this man, and it gives his name, and he was Hillel of Bethel. And it even records the names of his sons who died. It was Abiram and Segub. Because the Bible never warns us without any reason. And it records what this foolish man did. Because even after his firstborn son died, according to the curse, he still continued to set the gates. He couldn't restrain himself, even the death of his firstborn. And today, the city of Jericho is rebuilt, but they were smart enough not to build it on the original site. And so this whole lesson for us from Joshua, it really comes down to obeying the Lord, even in the little things. And if he's leading you to do something, it doesn't have to make sense. It all comes back to that Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6, that you're to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways you acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. So last week, Jericho was defeated, and we saw God honor Israel's commitment to obedience with their first victory, where God had made the impossible possible. But for the people, there was nothing in it for them to claim individually, because Jericho was not one to make anybody richer. The reason for these wars wasn't to make the people of Israel personally rich, but God was using the nation of Israel to bring judgment on the nations who had rejected him, the nations that worshiped demons. These are the people that celebrated all those pagan practices while debasing themselves and hurting each other, because God couldn't let that go on forever. But what Israel did receive from the Battle of Jericho was the knowledge that their God loved them and that he was with them. And having this victory, you had to feel good. You had to feel good because the opposite of that would have been defeat with loss of life. But Israel had lost no life. No one died, not even one person. And there's nobody that ever feels good about the death of a people, not even of the death of a wicked nation. And God certainly, he took no joy in their destruction, because he says that himself in Ezekiel 33:11, where he says, "As surely as I live, declares the Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather they would turn from their ways and live." All right, so now Israel, they have one foot in the land, and now the strongest of all their enemies is defeated. And it's like we said, if they can conquer Jericho, then there's no one who could stand before Israel. And that's exactly what Israel's thinking too. And Ai, it's not very far away from Jericho. It's only 15 miles away. And so what they're thinking that this is going to be Jericho Part 2, the sequel. And so Joshua, he starts this advance in Canaan, and he does it right away, because they're going to strike while the iron's hot. And they're going to do it exactly the same way that they did it with Jericho. And so Joshua, he sends out spies, just like they did with Jericho. And if you read it carefully, it'll say here, it says, Joshua isn't sending the spies from Gilgal, which is the area where they've all been camping. But what it says is that he's sending these spies out from Jericho. And so what that means, it means that they didn't wait at all. And they didn't take any time to go home or to go and get the Lord's instructions in this manner. And it doesn't say anywhere here that they ever sought the Lord. So I don't believe Joshua sought the Lord at all about this. So they have no instructions from the Lord. They're just running on their own steam. They're running out of their own self-reliance and their own pride. And this is all coming from one victory in Jericho. And so Joshua is assuming that God's going to do this same thing, and he's going to do it the same way, and he's going to give them victory in Ai, just like he did in Jericho. And it's like they're thinking like, well, yeah, we know how to win battles. That's what we do. But it wasn't really even their own victory. It was the Lord's victory. But now they're thinking they're the experts, and Ai is their next formidable enemy, and it's in their path to conquer Canaan. And what Ai is believed to have been, it's believed that Ai was this outpost to guard these other little small towns around them. It was there to guard the town of Beth-aven and Bethel. And Ai, it would have been an obstacle for Israel's advance into the rest of the land of Canaan. And this is all hill country. Ai is 1,700 feet above sea level, which is really, really high when you think about Jericho, because Jericho is actually 850 feet below sea level. And so even though this is a close distance, this is all uphill, 15 miles uphill. And so these spies, they come back and they tell Joshua, and they say, well, this is not like Jericho at all. It's so small. And the spies, they didn't come back with any stories about any walls or anybody who needed to be rescued like Rahab. And it's so small. We're not going to need very many of us to go up at all, because there's not a lot of people there. We can do this with only 2,000 or 3,000 men. And God here, he's not even a thought in their mind. And no one's talking about following an ark or about following priests, because nobody is seeking God or his thoughts about this at all. Nothing about conquering Ai. And you really pick up this attitude where they're thinking, we got this handled. We might have to trouble God with our Jerichos, with our big impossible problems, but we don't have to bother him with the little stuff. And all of this, of course, is just coming out of their pride. And somehow, Joshua, he's going along with all of this. And that word in Hebrew for thousands is eleph, which means a squad or a company of soldiers. And so what they're really saying here is that we don't need an army. We only need 2 to 3 companies of soldiers. That's all we need. And so they send 3, because they're probably trying to err on the safe side. But when we get to chapter 8 and we look at verse 25, it tells us that there's about 12,000 people in Ai. But they're so confident and they're operating in faith, but it's only a faith in themselves. There is no faith in God. And we don't know what went wrong here, but we know that they fled, and they were all chased downhill. And it says that they were chased all the way down to the gate as far as Shebarim. And Shebarim means quarries. And so these are very steep ravines. They're the ones that come before you get down to the Jordan Valley. And then we read that the men of Ai, that they struck down 36 men of Israel. And when I look at this, and when I read that Israel's casualties were only 36 men, where to me, where you had just read about all the men that they had killed in Jericho, to me, it doesn't seem like the loss was that big. But when you realize that they didn't lose not even one man at Jericho, not one at all. And Jericho was a much bigger city than Ai. And then when you find out that these are the only men of Israel that ever die in any of the battles that Israel ever fights in the land of Canaan. And so you realize that this doesn't have anything to do with how many men died. And they realized that. And they knew that the Lord wasn't with them anymore. He wasn't with them any longer. And it's something that they didn't know when they went into this battle because they never felt it and they never knew it. To them, it didn't feel any different. And you can look at this and you can see that they lost 12 men for every 1,000 men that they sent into battle. And so you wonder, you say, well, is that a coincidence? Or is it that the 12 men, that they represented each of the 12 tribes of Israel? And that's what I believe it is. I believe that's what made their hearts melt like water. And so now they're feeling the same way that all the inhabitants of Canaan were feeling about Israel when Israel came into the land, because that's what it said, that their hearts felt like water. So now they're overwhelmed and they're being defeated. They're running for their lives. They're being chased downhill by this little town of Ai. And then they come back and they tell Joshua. And when they went up that hill, they were so confident. But now they're coming back so beaten, where they just turned tail and ran. And it almost seems here like Joshua, that he overreacts, where now he's falling down before the Ark of the Covenant, and he's tearing his clothes, and he's throwing dust on his head, and he's crying, and he's wailing. And that's what the Jews do when somebody very close to them dies. And this is a sign of great mourning, great deep mourning. And Joshua, he does this all day. And all the elders, they join him, and they're all doing the same thing. They're all tearing their clothes, they're throwing dirt, they're crying, and they're wailing. And then Joshua, he starts blaming God, as if all this is God's fault. And Joshua's acting like this defeat is because of God's unfaithfulness. And Joshua says, alas. And every time that we read this word alas in the Bible, it's used to describe hopelessness. And so Joshua, he's very disillusioned here. And he couldn't believe that God had allowed this to happen to Israel. And so Joshua says, at last, Lord God, why have you brought this people over the Jordan at all? And then you just got to think, you got to go, wow, is this Joshua? Is this the good spy? Is this that guy who 40 years ago stood with God? He was one of the only ones who stood with God when the rest of Israel had forsaken God. This was Moses' assistant. This is the man who was chosen by God, the one that's known God and has watched God working with Israel for over 40 years. This is the God who Joshua met and he spoke with. And you have to remember, it was just about 8 days before this that he had just met the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, the commander of the Lord of hosts, of the Lord's armies. And now he's talking and he's sounding like one of the children of Israel, and he's saying it the exact same way that Israel complained against God when they were saved out of Egypt and they were brought into the wilderness. And then Joshua goes on and he keeps accusing God, and he's saying, did you do this to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites? And then Joshua says, to destroy us? And then he says the same thing in the same manner that Israel spoke about how God should have left them alone. And that's what you can read in Exodus 14 when Israel said, because there's no graves in Egypt that you had taken us away to die in the wilderness. Have you dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? And where Israel had told him that it would have been better for them to serve the Egyptians than for them to die in the wilderness. And right here, Joshua, he doesn't sound much different than them. And he says, oh, that we had been content to dwell on the other side of the Jordan. And all you got to say is, boo hoo hoo hoo. Oh, poor Joshua. Because Joshua, are you really saying that you would have been content to not enter the promised land, and that you would have been just as content to dwell on the other side of the Jordan? So Joshua here, he's acting much like unbelieving Israel. And then Joshua, he goes on from here, and now he starts to talk like Moses, where Moses, if you remember, he pleaded with God to restore Israel when God was going to cut them off because of that sin that they had committed with the golden calf at Mount Horeb. And that was all in Exodus 32:12, where Moses at that time, he was basically saying, hey, God, it's your reputation that's at stake here. Your reputation among the Egyptians, that you're not strong enough. The Egyptians are going to go around and they're going to call you names and say you're weak, that you couldn't save Israel. And that's not much different than what Joshua is saying here, where he's saying God's reputation is at stake. And he says, "O Lord, what shall I say when Israel turns back before its enemies? For the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear it, and they'll surround us and cut off our name from the earth. What will you do for your great name?" And it's like God ever depended on anyone for his great name. And so Joshua here, he doesn't sound much different than any of the people of Israel. He doesn't sound any different than the people he was from or the people he's leading. But now you kind of got to think for a second. You go, well, we kind of got to give him a little bit of a break here, because we know that Joshua, that he's a respectable man. And this is the first crisis that's ever come under his leadership. And there's information here that has not been revealed to Joshua yet. There's information that Joshua doesn't know about, but we already know about. Because Joshua doesn't know what it said in the beginning of this chapter in verse 1. Because if you remember when we left off last week, right after the victory of Jericho, when we got to the end of chapter 6, it said, "So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country." But today, when we start chapter 7, the very first word starts with a big but. And when you see a but in Scripture, it means you need to forget everything else that you've read up until now, because now it's all going to change. And none of this applies anymore. That all of that good is now going to all be undone. So Joshua, he had no idea where chapter 7 starts and where it says, "But the children of Israel committed a trespass regarding the accursed things. For Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took of the accursed things, so the anger of the Lord burned against the children of Israel."
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,